the growth of knowledge did not end with Anaximander, right? If we look around, we all know we have these nifty kind of devices, these cell phones that have, we get the internet on them, we have lights, we have heat, we have bridges, all kinds of stuff. So science made some advances from the days of Anaximander. And the next person that we're going to look at is, again, a person from Miletus, a student of Anaximander, Anaximenes. And like Anaximander, he too was responding to Anaximander. He thought there were problems in the theory. And let me give you an overall idea of what it is, where he differs from Anaximander, and then we're going to see how he is responding to a perceived difficulty in Anaximander's theory. Well, the first thing is, if I can get this to pop up, there it goes. He postulates air. Sorry about that. He postulates air as the arche, the origin, the material principle, the origin and composition of everything. And, it looks like maybe it's a step back, Anaximander had this theoretical entity, and Anaximenes is postulating air, one of the basic elements. But here's what he does that's kind of interesting. He offers a new explanation, and an explanation of something that Anaximander did not provide. And that is, his explanation, Anaximander thought of the basic stuff and qualities of the world as being opposites in conflict. By contrast, Anaximenes, has a different conception. He thinks the basic stuff and qualities that make up the cosmos are not opposed to each other, but they're different stages in a continuum. And I'll explain what I mean a continuum. There's across a spectrum, kind of like going from red, green, blue, violet, indigo, the spectrum of colors. Matter is a spectrum in the same way. And what changes things in this spectrum are two things, what we call rarefaction and condensation. Rarefaction is rarefaction and condensation. Rarefaction is probably a new word to you. It's not a commonly used word. And condensation. Condensation you are familiar with, right? You take a nice hot shower in your bathroom, and all of a sudden the water is running down the walls. The water condenses. The vapor condenses. Rarefaction is exactly the opposite. Think of it from rare, it makes it rare, it spreads it out. That is, condensation is the water is in the air and it gets together and it liquefies again and comes down your wall. Rarefaction is kind of the opposite process, if you think about it. If you're watching, the steam rise from the ocean on a really hot day on the beach, that's what you'd be seeing. Now, our continuum, or I should say Anaximenes' continuum, is made up of fire, air, wind, cloud, water, earth, and stone. And now you're probably wondering, how can these be a continuum? Stone and fire, or any of these things, we don't really get. But notice, according to Anaximenes, or his new theory, is that, and take a look, my green arrow represents condensation, and we could have green arrows all along in this spectrum. And the blue arrow represents rarefaction, and you see how that this is supposed to be a continuum. It might not be quite clear how we get that continuum. But here, let's think about a few things. Let's start with fire. Let's say we have a fire burning. And think of it, if you've ever gone out in the woods and made a fire from logs, if you want to put the fire out in the morning, what happens? Maybe you pour some water on it. What ends the fire. If you watch, at the end of the fire, you have the smoke coming off. So the idea is, if you stomp on the fire to put it out, what happens? Smoke goes up in the air. And then if you think about wind, if you push it around, air, if you push it around, creates wind. That is kind of, I guess the idea is you condense that and it becomes wind. And you really condense the air and you get a cloud, you get the vapor in it all together, and the cloud ultimately, with more condensation, leaves you to water. And water, as it gets compressed even more, at least this is according to the theory, I'm not defending the theory, I'm explaining it, becomes earth, sand. And when you take sand and you pack it in real tight, kind of like a brick, you end up with a stone. And going the other way, if you chop up the stone, you end up with kind of sand. If you take the earth and you kind of melt it down somehow, if you look at it, let's say you're melting metals, or which they probably did in the old days, because they did have metal weapons, you'd see some solid object turning into a liquid, a water-like object, and you boil the water and you see stuff going up, vapor creating the clouds. You know, clouds are moving around and the wind starts getting going. Imagine you're sitting there watching a storm develop. You see how the clouds spreading out, creating wind all over the place. And, wind gets spread out and it calms down. It's no longer blowing. All we have is air. Now the question, how do you get from air to fire? Well, if you guys have ever seen somebody or ever had to make a fire without having a match, or even if you do have a match, to get the fire going, to get it started, if you start with a spark, you get the spark glowing and you get some embers going. You get some small pieces of wood, paper, or something to start burning. Or you might, as a kid, you might have taken a magnifying glass. At least I know I did this as a kid. Maybe it's different nowadays. And you'd focus the light on a piece of paper, and what do you start doing then? You start blowing. And when you blow on the spark and the fire and the embers, what happens? All of a sudden the rest of it catches fire. So this whole continuum and the process is somewhat plausible, based, like Thales and Anaximenes' solution, based on observation. But notice what this does that we didn't have in the case of Anaximenes. In the case of Anaximenes, we had that poetic statement about the war going on between the opposites and paying for the injustice, and we don't have any explanation of the process. Here we now have an explanation of the process, how things transform, what the basic stuff is. The basic stuff is air. Now the question is, why is the basic stuff air? Right? It could have been anything on this continuum. Why did he pick air? Well, let's think about what he did. He rejected the apiron, that mixture, the primordial mixture of all stuff. With scientists, when they start talking about how life evolved or how the earth evolved, everything is kind of mixed together, and they call this primordial, this ancient mixture from which life was produced. Biologists talk that way. If you look at it, he didn't like it because it was unperceived. You couldn't be certain of its existence. Now, if you're looking at the familiar elements on the continuum, fire, air, wind, clouds, water, earth, stone, air is kind of the most neutral. And what do I mean by the most neutral? It's most like a theoretical entity, right? You can't put it, you can't grab it with your hand. You can't put it in your pocket. You can't transport it. In fact, I guess the question is, how did these guys even know that air existed? I guess you watch people breathe. You see when it gets a little cool, because of the moisture in your breath, in your air, you actually see vapor coming out in the cooler weather. So it's the most neutral. It's most like a theoretical entity, but this one, we have no doubt, exists. And in addition to which, he probably just believed that air was really the original element. That's how everything got started and got all together. And air started, it went in both directions. It rarefied, it went through rarefaction, became fire, and it got condensed, and it became wind, clouds, water, earth, and rock finally. Okay, now let's quickly kind of compare and contrast the Anaximander versus Anaximenes to give us an idea of what is going on and how this scientific method, looking for keep in mind, they're trying to explain what the cosmos is made of, what the universe is made of, where it got started, what's going on with it. Well, first thing is, let's think of their criteria for deciding the best explanation and compare Anaximander versus Anaximenes. Well, on this one, you want to try to explain the underlying process by which something happens. Well, here, Anaximenes has an explanation. Anaximander makes it, kind of going back to the godlike stuff. It's a conflict. Well, stones and earth aren't we don't see them. They don't duke it out, so to speak. They're not fighting. And the other thing that Anaximenes' theory has over Anaximander's theory is that we can explain the phenomena using things that exist, right? Air, it's not this never-seen entity. By contrast, this apiron, this primordial basic mixture of stuff, it's a theoretical entity. It's never been seen, and we really don't have an explanation for how one opposite overcomes another, what's going on, how they get transformed. So in this regard, air seems to be better. That is, Anaximenes seems to have a better explanation because, look, it is observed, and we do have the process by which we can explain what is going on. Okay, so notice, we've been dealing with the philosophers, the three philosophers, the original philosophers from Miletus, sometimes known as the Milesian philosopher, or the Milesian schools. Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. It's a mouthful, and I'm hoping you guys can remember it. However, what they all have in common is that they are looking for the material principle that explains the origin of the cosmos. Where did the cosmos come from? And it does the second thing. It also explains what the cosmos is actually made of. So the basic thing, the basic explanation for these guys, for the Milesians, is it's matter. It's stuff. This is the basic, and these undergo a process. And in a second, we're going to turn to, the second is in the next segment, we're going to turn to a philosopher called Heraclitus, who looks at it from a very different perspective. It's not matter that matters, bad pun. It's not matter that's the essential part of the universe. It's the basic part of the universe, but rather it's change. That is, he looks around and he says, look at everything. Take a look at Socrates. He didn't know Socrates because Socrates is after his time, but take a look at a person. Person doesn't exist, they come into existence. They change over time. Start as a baby. Think of our ship of Theseus or our professor of Theseus examples. Over time, the thing changes, the object person changes, and finally they die and they go out of existence. So he's going to think that change is more fundamental than matter.